My son slapped me 25 times in front of his wife over the course of a single weekend. They were not physical strikes, but each one was a calculated blow to my dignity, designed to remind me of my place in what he claimed was his home. I did not raise my voice or cause a scene. Instead, I waited until he left for a mandatory corporate retreat, and I sold the very house he was sleeping in right out from under him. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that disrespecting your parents should come with absolute and devastating consequences. My name is Bruce. I am 70 years old, and for 40 years I worked as a heavy machinery contractor. I built a life with calloused hands and aching joints, saving every penny, so my son Justin would never have to know the feeling of bone-deep physical exhaustion. I paid for his college education, his first car, and the tailored suits he wears to his junior finance executive job. But somewhere along the way, the boy I raised to be humble turned into a man obsessed with appearances. He married Megan, a woman whose ambition was matched only by her arrogance. It was a Friday morning, and I was on my hands and knees on the cold marble floor of their master bathroom. The house was a sprawling $1.8 million suburban estate in an exclusive community outside Chicago. It had soaring ceilings, imported tile, and massive glass windows. I lived in the 400-square-foot guest annex attached to the garage. To the outside world, and to my son and daughter-in-law, I was just the live-in handyman. The sink trap had burst the night before. I was wedged under the vanity holding a wrench, my shoulders screaming in protest against the awkward angle. Megan was standing in the doorway, her arms crossed, tapping her foot impatiently. She was wearing a silk robe holding a cup of artisan coffee. "Bruce," she sighed loudly, using my first name instead of calling me Dad. "Are you going to be under there all day? I have a facial appointment at 11, and I cannot have you tracking grease across my white carpets." I wiped my forehead with the back of my arm, leaving a smudge of dirt. "I am almost done, Megan." The threading on the pipe was stripped. It takes time to replace it properly. Justin walked in, adjusting his expensive silk tie in the vanity mirror, completely ignoring the fact that his 70-year-old father was contorted under his sink. "Just wrap it up quickly," he snapped, not even looking down at me. "You should have fixed it yesterday. We are hosting the senior partners tonight, and this place needs to be flawless. Do not make me regret letting you stay here." I tightened the final bolt and pulled myself out from under the sink. My knees popped loudly in the quiet bathroom. Neither of them offered a hand to help me up. I gathered my tools into my rusted metal box. "I will clean up the floor," I said quietly. Just as I reached the hallway, Megan called out after me, "And Bruce, another thing. Your truck. You need to move it." I stopped and turned around. My truck was a 15-year-old battered heavy-duty pickup. It was the truck that had fed our family, the truck I used to drive Justin to his baseball games. "Move it where?" I asked. "Down the street," she read, waving her hand dismissively. "Park it 3 blocks down by the community entrance. My boss and Justin's partners are coming over tonight. We are parking the luxury cars out front. Your rusted piece of junk ruins the entire curb appeal of the property." Justin nodded in agreement, checking his watch. "She is right. It looks terrible. Honestly, it is an eyesore. We are trying to project a certain image tonight, of success, of wealth. Your whole poverty aesthetic in your flannel shirts and work boots is not going to work for us tonight. Stay in your annex while the guests are here." I looked at my son, the boy whose diapers I changed, the boy I carried on my shoulders. He was looking at me with undisguised embarrassment. The urge to yell to remind him of everything I had given him burned in my chest. But I've always been a man who measures his actions. Words are cheap. I simply nodded. "I will move the truck right now." I walked out the front door, the morning sun hitting my face. I climbed into the cab of my old truck, the worn leather seats familiar and comforting. I started the engine, listening to its reliable hum, and drove it 3 blocks down, parking it out of sight just as I was ordered. I walked back toward the estate, my hands shoved deep into my pockets. The walk back took about 15 minutes. The neighborhood was quiet, filled with manicured lawns and towering oak trees. As I approached the house, I decided to walk around the back through the garden to enter my annex directly. The back patio had massive sliding glass doors that were pushed open to let in the breeze. As I walked silently across the stone pavers, I heard Justin's voice carrying over the patio. He was on a phone call, pacing back and forth with a confident, arrogant swagger. "Yes, absolutely," David Justin was saying, laughing smoothly. "The networking dinner is going to be fantastic. I am really looking forward to showing you the new estate. Yes, I bought it outright last year. 1.8 million, but the market is booming, so it was a steal." I froze behind a large decorative planter. Justin continued talking, his voice dripping with false humility. "Well, you know how it is. It is a massive property. I even have a little attached unit out back. I let my destitute father live there out of charity. He went broke a few years ago, so I took him in. It is the least I can do, right? You have to take care of the people who failed to plan for their own future." My breath caught in my throat. Destitute father. Charity. Failed to plan. I did not confront him. I did not storm onto the patio and break his phone. I simply turned around and walked quietly into my small 400-square-foot annex. I locked the door behind me. The space was simple but clean. A small bed, a kitchenette, and a small desk. I walked over to the desk and pulled out a heavy fireproof lockbox from the bottom drawer. I entered the combination and opened it. Inside, resting on top of a stack of investment portfolios and offshore account statements, was a pristine legal document. The property deed to the $1.8 million estate. I picked it up and read the clean-typed words. The property was owned entirely free and clear by a blind, limited liability company called Blue Collar Holdings. And as the sole proprietor of Blue Collar Holdings, I owned every single blade of grass, every marble tile, and every pane of glass in that house. Justin did not own the house. He did not pay a mortgage. He paid zero rent. I had purchased the home through the company and allowed him to live there to help him get a head start on his marriage, keeping my identity as the owner, a secret to teach him responsibility. But now I realized my generosity had only bred a monster. I traced my calloused finger over the official seal on the deed. He wanted to pretend he was the lord of the manor. He wanted to treat me like a disposable peasant. I placed the deed back in the box and closed the lid with a solid, heavy click. I was not going to yell. I was going to let him dig his own grave, and then I was going to push him in. By 7 o'clock that evening, the caterers had transformed the main house into a fortress of luxury. I sat in my small annex, listening to the clinking of crystal glasses and the soft hum of jazz music bleeding through the walls. I had planned to spend the night reading quietly, but a sharp knock on my door shattered that peace. Justin stood on my small porch holding a plain black blazer on a wire hanger. He thrust it toward me without saying hello. "The valet company sent 2 drivers instead of 4, he said, his voice tight with panic. "Guests are arriving in 10 minutes. Cars will be backed up to the main road. I need you at the front door right now. Put this on and do not speak to anyone unless they speak to you first." I looked at the cheap polyester jacket and then at my son. "You want me to park cars?" I asked, my voice perfectly level. "I want you to make yourself useful," he snapped, adjusting his silver cufflinks. "You live here for... The least you can do is pull your weight when I have the most important night of my career happening inside." Megan walked up behind him, sipping champagne from a thin flute. "And please, Bruce," she added with a tight smile, "be careful with the leather interiors. Do not leave dirt on their floor mats." I took the jacket. I slipped it over my shoulders. It was tight across my back, a physical reminder of the box they were trying to force me into. I walked to the grand entrance and took my place by the massive double doors. The luxury cars began to roll up the circular driveway, a parade of polished metal and bright headlights. Porsches and sleek black sedans crawled to a stop in front of the porch. As I stepped forward to open the doors, I realized something profound. When you wear a black blazer and stand by a car door, you cease to be a human being to the people stepping out. You become a piece of furniture. You become completely invisible. Men in tailored suits tossed their heavy key fobs at my chest without making eye contact. Women draped in cashmere and smelling of expensive perfume handed me their heavy winter coats without a word of thanks. I smiled, politely nodded, and ran back and forth across the sprawling driveway, parking vehicles worth more than most people make in a decade. My knees ached from the hard pavement, and the crisp evening wind bit through the thin fabric of the blazer, but I did not complain. Being invisible gave me a distinct advantage. Because these wealthy guests did not see me as a person, they did not filter their conversations when I was standing right next to them. I parked a silver convertible and walked back to the porch just as two older men stepped out to smoke cigars. They were senior partners at Justin's financial firm. I recognized one of them from a photograph Justin had proudly shown me months ago. His name was Mr. Sullivan. I stood quietly in the shadows of the stone pillars, pretending to organize a row of coats on a rolling rack. "Justin is trying too hard tonight," Sullivan muttered, puffing on his cigar. "It is all a bit desperate, do you not think?" The other man chuckled, adjusting his scarf. "The kid is over-leveraged, Sullivan. I saw his numbers last quarter. He is living way beyond his means, trying to play in the big leagues. If he does not land the corporate expansion account by next month, he is going to sink fast. I hear he is strapped for cash." I smoothed the collar of a wool coat, my hands steady. So that was the truth. The fancy suits, the expensive catered dinners, the desperate need to impress. It was all a house of cards. Justin was drowning in his own ambition. He was pretending to be a titan of industry, while secretly suffocating under the weight of his own lies. A few minutes later, a sleek black car pulled up. I opened the door for a younger executive who was loudly complaining on his phone about the housing market. He tossed me his keys and muttered a complaint about the neighborhood being too far from the city. I slid into the driver's seat, breathing in the scent of fresh leather. My rough hands gripped the steering wheel, and I carefully backed the car into a tight space near the hedges. I sat in the dark interior for a moment, letting the engine idle. My own son had stripped me of my dignity in front of his peers. He had relegated me to a servant in the very house I owned. But instead of breaking me, this humiliation was giving me the exact ammunition I needed. I was gathering the pieces of his fragile ego, one whispered conversation at a time. I stepped out of the car and locked the doors. I walked back toward the glowing lights of the estate, ready to take the next coat, ready to catch the next set of keys. I was the invisible man in the background, simply watching and waiting, while my son danced blindly on the edge of his own ruin. The night dragged on, and the crisp autumn air turned bitter. My feet ached from pacing the driveway, but my mind was laser-focused. I was no longer just a father enduring an ungrateful child. I was a quiet observer documenting every transgression. I decided to count them. I called them slaps. They were not physical strikes, but sharp, stinging blows to my pride and my heart, delivered with precision by the people who were supposed to be my family. Slap number 1 happened when I walked into the grand foyer to grab more coat hangers. Megan breezed past me and handed me her empty martini glass without a single word or a glance in my direction. She discarded it into my hands as if I were a piece of living furniture designed only for her convenience. Slap number 2 came from Justin. He was showing a group of potential investors the architectural details of the sweeping staircase. When he noticed me standing near the door, waiting to take a guest's coat, he actually snapped his fingers at me. He pointed toward the kitchen, banishing me to the shadows, like a stray dog that had wandered too close to the dining table. Slap number 3 was subtle but incredibly cruel. A guest asked Justin if I was the hired help for the evening. Justin laughed loudly and told the man that good help is hard to find, especially when you have to settle for the discount option. He chuckled at his own joke, entirely unbothered by the fact that the discount option was his own father. I swallowed the humiliation and stepped into the formal dining room to refill a silver tray of water glasses, trying to remain invisible. The room was bathed in the warm, rich glow of a crystal chandelier. Megan was standing near the fireplace, holding court with a circle of wealthy wives. She tilted her head back, laughing at a joke, and the ambient light caught something sparkling brilliantly at her throat. My breath caught in my chest. The world around me seemed to stop spinning. It was a deep green emerald pendant surrounded by antique diamonds resting delicately on her collarbone. I knew that necklace intimately. I knew the weight of it, and I knew the history behind it. I had purchased it for my late wife 40 years ago after I completed my very first successful contracting job. I had worked grueling 80-hour weeks, my hands covered in blisters and scars, just to afford that stone. It was her most prized possession. Before she passed away, she held my hand and made me promise to keep it safe, to cherish it as a symbol of the life we built from absolutely nothing. I had secured that necklace inside a velvet box and locked it within my private fireproof safe in the guest annex. Megan had not just borrowed a piece of jewelry for a party. She had invaded my sanctuary. She had picked the lock of my private safe and stolen the most precious memory I had of the woman I loved. I stared at the deep green stone, feeling a cold, hollow ache spread through my chest. This was slap number 4. It was no longer just arrogance or youthful disrespect. It was a profound and unforgivable violation. It was outright theft. Megan was wearing my dead wife's legacy as a prop to impress people she barely knew. I felt my hands tremble, gripping the silver tray so tightly my knuckles turned white, but I forced myself to remain silent. I turned around and walked out of the room before my face could betray the storm raging inside me. I retreated to the front porch, letting the freezing night air cool the burning rage in my veins. I stood under the porch light, trying to steady my breathing. A black town car pulled up to the curb, and an older gentleman stepped out. He had silver hair and kind eyes, carrying an aura of genuine class that money alone cannot buy. He handed me his heavy wool coat and smiled warmly. "You have been running all night, my friend," he said, his voice full of sincere appreciation. "It is a bitter evening to be working the door. Thank you for your hard work." He reached into his tailored pocket and pulled out a crisp $100 bill, extending his hand toward me. It was a gesture of respect, a quiet acknowledgement of the hard labor I had been performing all night. I reached out to accept his kindness, but before my fingers could touch the paper, a hand snatched it straight out of the air. It was Justin. He had stepped out onto the porch, flashing his polished white teeth at the older gentleman. He smoothly folded the bill and slid it into his own suit pocket. "I will take care of the staff, Mr. Vance," Justin said smoothly. "We make sure everyone is well compensated here." The older man nodded, completely oblivious to the deception, and walked inside the house. Justin lingered on the porch for a second, after the heavy wooden door closed. He looked at me and his charming smile dropped instantly, morphing into a cold, hard smirk. He patted the pocket where he had just stowed my money. He leaned in close to me, smelling of expensive cologne and expensive wine. "You get free rent, old man," he whispered maliciously. "Consider this $100 your contribution to the utility bill." He turned on his heel and walked back into the warmth of the party, leaving me standing alone in the freezing cold. That was slap number 5. My own son had looked me in the eye and robbed me. He had stolen my money, and his wife had stolen my most sacred memories. The stakes had shifted entirely. They believed I was powerless. They thought I was a weak, destitute old man who would just lower his head and take the abuse because I had nowhere else to go. I closed my eyes and took a slow, deep breath, letting the frigid air fill my lungs. The tally was growing, and my patience was dissolving into something much more dangerous. I was not going to break. I was going to let them build their mountain of sins. I was going to let them steal and mock and parade around in their stolen glory, knowing that I possessed the power to shatter the earth right beneath their feet. The night deepened, and the temperature dropped, but the chill inside the house was far worse. I moved silently through the sprawling rooms, collecting discarded napkins and empty crystal glasses. The wealthy guests treated me like a ghost moving through their peripheral vision. I was just the tired old man in the cheap, tight blazer. But behind my quiet demeanor, my mind was cataloging every single detail. I walked into the formal parlor to clear a silver tray of half-eaten appetizers. Justin was standing by the towering stone fireplace with a broad-shouldered man holding a glass of expensive bourbon. This was the senior partner man Justin desperately needed to impress, to save his failing career and secure his corporate expansion. As I reached past them for a plate, the partner paused and looked at me with a hint of genuine curiosity. "Justin, who is the older gentleman helping out tonight?" the partner asked, taking a sip of his drink. "He looks somewhat familiar to me." I froze, keeping my back turned toward them. I waited for my son to introduce me, to simply say, "This is my father." Instead, Justin lowered his voice, adopting a tone of fake sympathetic sorrow that made my stomach churn. "Oh, that is just Bruce," Justin whispered, sighing heavily. "He is my father, actually. We had to take him in recently because his mind is slipping badly. Early onset dementia, they think. It is incredibly tragic, but keeping him busy with simple, repetitive tasks around the house keeps him grounded and stops him from wandering off into traffic." That was slap number 6. I was not just stealing my money or my dignity anymore. He was actively erasing my sanity. He was painting me as a broken, mindless burden simply to elevate his own image as a merciful savior in front of his boss. I gripped the edge of the heavy silver tray, my jaw locked so tight my teeth ached. I wanted to turn around and speak with perfect clarity to prove to that room that my mind was sharper than it had ever been. But I swallowed the bitter taste of betrayal and kept walking. If he wanted them to think I was oblivious, I would play the part perfectly while I tightened the noose. The next 2 hours were a blur of calculated indignities. Slap 7 happened when a younger executive spilled a sticky cocktail on his expensive leather shoes. Justin tossed me a damp bar towel and ordered me to get on my hands and knees to wipe it off, refusing to let the man clean his own mess. Slap 8 came when a guest asked me for directions to the restroom. Before I could speak, Megan cut me off loudly, telling the guest not to confuse the poor old man with complex questions. Slaps 9, 10, and 11 were a rapid-fire sequence of pure disrespect. I was bumped into hard by the group of laughing men without a single apology. I was handed dirty toothpicks directly into my bare palm. I listened from the hallway as Justin loudly complained to a group of his peers about how much it costs to feed a freeloader who contributes nothing to the household. Every casual sneer, every dismissive wave of a hand added to the tally. I was a proud man who had worked heavy construction for 4 decades. Hearing myself reduced to a parasite in a house I bought with my own blood and sweat was a unique kind of torture. Slaps 12, 13, and 14 came when Justin demanded I go out into the freezing cold 3 separate times to fetch specific cigars from his luxury car. He refused to let me put on my heavy winter coat, claiming the thick flannel would look incredibly unprofessional if a guest saw me walking back in. I walked through the bitter wind, shivering violently, my old bones aching from the freezing temperatures. But the cold outside was nothing compared to the absolute ice forming in my heart. I was not a victim. I was a judge sitting in silent deliberation, gathering irrefutable evidence for a final verdict. The most devastating blow of this hour, slap number 15, happened near the grand sweeping staircase in the main foyer. The party was reaching its peak, and the noise level was a dull roar of laughter and clinking glass. Megan was giving a tour of the home's custom architecture to a group of highly influential corporate wives. I was standing near the bottom banister, wiping down a scuff mark on the polished hardwood floor. I was on my hands and knees yet again doing the dirty work they deemed entirely beneath them. One of the women, a wealthy socialite draped in heavy diamonds, looked down at me with a mixture of pity and mild discomfort. She turned to Megan and smiled softly. "It is so kind of you to employ the elderly for your events," she noted. "What staffing agency did you use to find him?" Megan let out a high-pitched theatrical laugh that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. Her hand reached up to lightly touch the stolen vintage emerald necklace resting against her collarbone. "Oh, we did not use an agency," Megan said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "That is just Bruce. He is our charity case. He had absolutely nothing left to his name and nowhere to go, so Justin and I took pity on him. We let him live in the tiny annex out by the garage. You have to give back to the less fortunate in your community, right?" The group of women murmured their approval, praising Megan for her incredible generosity and her massive heart. Our charity case. That was slap number 15. I slowly stood up, the damp cleaning rag clutched tightly in my right hand. I looked directly into Megan's eyes. For a fraction of a second, her fake, confident smile faltered. She looked at me and saw something in my gaze that was not confusion, or submission, or senility. She saw a quiet, terrifying clarity. She saw a predator watching its prey step into a trap. But her sheer arrogance quickly masked her momentary doubt. She turned her back to me, flipping her hair, and continued her tour as if I had completely ceased to exist. I walked away from this grand staircase, my heart pounding a steady, rhythmic drumbeat in my chest. They were dismantling my reputation, piece by piece, lie by lie. To these powerful people, I was a senile, destitute charity case who owed my very breath to the mercy of a wealthy, successful son. They were stealing my history, my sharp mind, and my hard-earned pride. But the intense frustration burning in my gut was matched only by the incredible anticipation of what was to come. They did not know that the pathetic charity case owned the very floorboards they were standing on. They did not know that the senile old man held their entire financial future locked away in a single fireproof box. I was entirely invisible to them, and that was their most fatal mistake. You never see the avalanche coming when you are too busy admiring the snow. The night was not over, and the slaps were still counting up. My absolute silence was the loudest and most dangerous weapon I possessed. I took a deep breath, smoothed the lapels of my cheap, tight blazer, and walked right back into the crowded room. I was ready for whatever they threw at me next, because every single insult was just another heavy nail in the coffin they were building for themselves. The evening crept toward midnight, and the air inside the house grew thick with the smell of roasted meats and expensive perfumes. I was assigned to circulate the patio with a tray of fresh cocktails. The outdoor heaters were blazing, casting a strange orange glow over the stone pavers. I approached the far corner of the terrace where Justin, Megan, and Mr. Sullivan, the senior partner, were standing away from the rest of the crowd. I moved silently, keeping to the shadows of the tall potted plants. "I need to know you have the capital to back this play," Justin Sullivan was saying, his voice low and serious. "The firm is not going to approve a $500,000 expansion without rock-solid collateral. We need liquidity, Justin, or we need assets." I paused behind the broad leaves of a palm tree, holding the heavy silver tray against my chest. Justin laughed, a smooth, practiced sound. "We have the assets, Mr. Sullivan. Megan and I are fully prepared to leverage this estate to secure the $500,000. "But the house is not in your name," Sullivan countered, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "I saw the initial background check, Justin. It is held by some blind company and managed by your father. That is exactly why we handled it internally." Megan chimed in, her voice dripping with artificial confidence. "Justin's father is not well. His mind is completely gone. We had a lawyer draft a comprehensive medical power of attorney last month. Justin has full legal authority over the estate and all associated assets. My husband signed the collateral paperwork this morning." I stopped breathing. The cold night air seemed to vanish, leaving me suffocating in a vacuum of pure shock. A medical power of attorney, signed collateral paperwork. These were not just casual insults. These were calculated felonies. Slap 16 was the realization that they had forged my signature. Slap 17 was the fake notary they must have bribed. Slap 18 was the weaponization of my supposed dementia. Slap 19 through 24 hit me in rapid succession as I realized the absolute magnitude of their betrayal. They had literally stolen the roof over my head to fund a desperate corporate gamble. They had legally erased me while I was quietly fixing their plumbing. I stood in the shadows, my heart hammering a violent rhythm against my ribs. I wanted to step out from behind the plants and shatter the crystal glasses. I wanted to grab Sullivan by the collar and tell him that the man standing in front of him was a desperate fraud. But a louder, colder voice in my head ordered me to stay still. I let them finish their drinks. I let them walk back inside, basking in their stolen glory. The party eventually migrated to the formal dining room for the main course. I was instructed to stand in the corner near the swinging kitchen doors, ready to clear plates. The guests took their seats around the massive custom dining table. It was a breathtaking piece of furniture. It was 12 feet long, carved from a single slab of reclaimed white oak. I knew every grain of that wood. I had spent 4 months in my dusty workshop, meticulously sanding the edges, treating the surface with natural oils, and building the heavy iron legs. I had built that table as a wedding gift for Justin and Megan, hoping they would raise their future children around it. My hands still bore the faint white scars from when the sander had slipped during the final polishing. Mr. Sullivan ran his hand admiringly over the smooth edge of the wood. "This is an absolutely magnificent piece, Justin," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the large room. "The craftsmanship is flawless. Where did you find a piece of timber like this?" The entire room fell quiet, waiting for my son to answer. Justin smiled, taking a slow sip of his red wine. He looked directly across the room, locking his eyes onto mine. He knew exactly what he was doing. "I had it imported from Italy," Justin said, his voice carrying clearly over the soft background music. "It cost a small fortune, but you know me, Mr. Sullivan. I appreciate true artistry. It takes a sophisticated eye to understand this kind of work." Justin leaned back in his chair, maintaining his dead-eyed stare at me. "My father actually thought we should just buy something cheap from a hardware store. He would not know real craftsmanship if it hit him in the face." A few of the guests chuckled politely at the joke. Megan smiled and reached across the table to pat Justin on the hand. That was slap number 25. It was the breaking point. The moment the final thread of my paternal mercy snapped and turned to ash. He was not just stealing my money or my house anymore. He was spitting on my love. He was taking the blood and sweat I poured into a gift meant for his future family and using it to mock me in front of strangers. But Justin was not finished playing his twisted game. He held my gaze, a cruel smirk playing on his lips, and he deliberately tilted his wine glass. The deep crimson liquid spilled over the rim, splashing onto the pristine white oak. The wine pooled and began to slowly bleed into the natural grain of the wood I had spent hundreds of hours perfecting. Justin raised his hand high in the air and snapped his fingers sharply, echoing like a gunshot in the quiet room. "Bruce," he called out, using my first name yet again. "Clean this up immediately before it stains my beautiful floors." The entire dining room turned to look at me. Wealthy men in dark suits and women in heavy jewelry stared at the old man in the cheap blazer standing by the kitchen door. They waited for the servant to rush forward with a rag. They waited for the broken charity case to drop to his knees and wipe up the mess of the superior man. I looked at the spilled wine bleeding into the wood. I looked at the stolen emerald necklace resting against Megan's throat. I looked at the arrogant, self-satisfied smirk on the face of the boy I had given my entire life to protect. I did not feel anger anymore. Anger is hot and messy and unpredictable. What I felt was a cold, absolute zero clarity. I knew exactly what needed to be done. The tally was complete. The evidence was gathered. The trial was over and the verdict was guilty. I walked slowly across the dining room, my footsteps heavy and silent on the imported rugs. I picked up a thick white cloth napkin from the side station. I approached the head of the table where my son was sitting like a king. I leaned down over the spilled wine. I wiped the crimson liquid off the beautiful oak surface, my movements steady and precise. I did not say a single word. I did not look at him again. I tossed the stained napkin into a nearby silver bucket, turned my back on the entire room, and walked out the back door into the freezing night. The game of patience was officially over. It was time to burn his kingdom to the ground. The cold night air hit my face like a splash of ice water as I stepped out the back door of the main house. I left the warmth of the dining room, the smell of expensive wine, and the sound of my son's arrogant laughter behind me. I did not look back. I walked across the manicured lawn, the frost crunching softly beneath my heavy work boots. Every step I took away from that mansion felt like shedding a physical weight. The tired, hunched old man who had spent the last 5 hours fetching coats and wiping floors was evaporating into the freezing autumn wind. By the time I reached the door of my small guest annex, I was no longer a victim. I was the architect of their absolute ruin. I stepped inside the 400-square-foot space and locked the deadbolt. The click of the heavy metal lock echoed in the quiet room, serving as the final period at the end of a very long sentence. I stripped off the cheap, tight polyester blazer Justin had forced me to wear. I did not hang it up. I dropped it directly into the trash can. I unbuttoned my collar, rolled up my sleeves, and walked over to the small sink to wash my hands. I scrubbed the grease, the spilled wine, and the indignity of the evening from my skin. I looked at myself in the small mirror above the sink. My eyes were completely clear. The sorrow that had been sitting heavy in my chest all night was gone, replaced by a surgical, cold, calculating precision. I walked over to the desk and opened the bottom drawer, pulling out the heavy fireproof lockbox. I spun the dial, entered the combination, and opened the lid. I bypassed the property deed this time and reached underneath it, pulling out a thick black smartphone. Justin and Megan thought I only had the cheap prepaid flip phone they had given me last year, so they could monitor my calls and track my location. They had no idea I maintained a secure, encrypted line strictly for my private business affairs. I sat on the edge of the narrow bed and dialed a number I knew by heart. It was almost 1 in the morning, but I knew he would be awake. Colin was a man who did not sleep. He was a ruthless corporate real estate attorney, a barracuda in a tailored suit, who handled hostile takeovers, liquidations, and multi-million-dollar acquisitions for the most powerful firms in the city. He had been my personal lawyer for 15 years, and he was the only person on earth who knew the true extent of my financial portfolio. The line rang twice before he answered. His voice was sharp, wide awake, and perfectly clear. "Bruce," he said, "it is 1 in the morning. Tell me you are calling from a beach in the Caribbean, and that you finally decided to retire." "I am calling from the annex, Colin," I replied, my voice perfectly level. "And I need you to listen to me very carefully. I am only going to say this once." The tone of my voice instantly shifted the dynamic. Colin stopped typing on whatever keyboard he was working on. The background noise on his end vanished. He knew me well enough to know I never called at this hour unless the ground was shifting beneath our feet. "I have your full attention, Bruce. Tell me what is happening." I laid it out for him with absolute clinical detachment. I told him about the networking dinner. I told him about the stolen emerald necklace resting against my daughter-in-law's throat. I told him about the spilled wine and the imported Italian table. But then I gave him the information that mattered. I told him what I had overheard on the patio between Justin Megan and the senior partner of the financial firm. "Justin is pitching a $500,000 corporate expansion," I explained to Colin. "He told his boss that he has the assets to back the play. He is leveraging the estate as collateral for the investment." Colin let out a sharp, harsh breath. "Bruce, that estate is held by your blind, limited liability company. Justin does not own a single brick of that house. How exactly is he leveraging a property he does not own? That is the part you are going to love." "Colin," I said, staring at the blank wall of my tiny room. Megan bragged to the senior partner that they handled it internally. She said my mind was completely gone. She told him they had a lawyer drafted a comprehensive medical power of attorney last month, granting Justin full legal authority over the estate and all my associated assets. Justin signed the collateral paperwork this morning. The silence on the encrypted line was so heavy it felt physical. When Colin finally spoke, his voice was a lethal, venomous whisper. "Bruce, that is federal wire fraud. That is felony forgery. He leveraged a property he does not legally own using a medical proxy that does not exist and a notary who took a bribe. This is not just a family dispute anymore. This is a massive, multi-tiered corporate crime. I can make one phone call right now and have federal agents kicking down his imported front doors before breakfast. He will be in handcuffs before his hangover wears off." I closed my eyes and pictured the grand dining room. I pictured Justin standing there playing the wealthy king showing off his stolen crown. Sending him to jail tonight would be too easy. It would give him an excuse. He would play the victim. He would tell his friends and his colleagues that he made a desperate mistake under pressure. He would retain a shred of his dignity. I was not going to leave him a single shred. "No, Colin," I said firmly. "I do not want the police yet. If he goes to jail tonight, he gets to be a martyr. I want to take away the one thing he values more than his freedom. I want to take his image. I want to take his kingdom, and I want to do it so thoroughly that he never recovers." "What are your orders?" Bruce, Colin asked, his voice dropping into pure business mode. I took a deep breath. "We are initiating Protocol Zero." I heard Colin shifting in his leather chair. Protocol Zero was a contingency plan we had drafted nearly a decade ago. It was a scorched earth legal strategy designed for hostile corporate raids. It was a mechanism to instantly liquidate assets, dissolve physical holdings, and completely erase a footprint within 24 hours to prevent a hostile takeover. I had never needed to use it in business. I was now adapting it to dismantle my own son. "You understand the gravity of what you are asking," Bruce Colin said carefully, measuring his words. "If we execute Protocol Zero on the residential estate, we bypass the standard market. We sell to a corporate developer for cash at a heavy discount to secure an immediate close. Once I file these papers, the house belongs to a faceless corporation. Justin will be legally trespassing the second the ink dries. He will be homeless. He will be financially ruined because he leveraged his career on fake collateral. There is no unwinding this once I hit the button." "I mud his choice when he claimed he imported my wedding gift from Italy," I replied, my voice devoid of any warmth or hesitation. "He made his choice when he stole my wife's necklace and treated me like a stray dog." "Do it, Colin. Prepare the corporate buyer. I want the sale finalized within 48 hours. Consider it done, Bruce. What is your window for the physical extraction?" "Justin and Megan are leaving tomorrow morning for a mandatory overnight corporate retreat," I explained, mapping out the timeline in my head. "They will be gone for exactly 36 hours. They think they have me backed into a corner. They think I am too arthritic to sign their fake insurance papers until Friday. That is our window." Colin let out a dark, admiring chuckle. "You are a terrifying man, Bruce. I will have the corporate buyers ready with the cash transfer by tomorrow afternoon. I will dispatch the extraction team to handle the physical property. Sleep well, my friend. The war is already won." I hung up the phone and placed it back inside the fireproof box. I lay down on the narrow bed, staring up at the ceiling. The sounds of the party in the main house had finally died down. The wealthy guests had gone home. Justin and Megan were likely sleeping soundly in their massive master bedroom, dreaming of their $500,000 expansion and their perfect stolen life. They had no idea that while they were sipping expensive wine and laughing at the old man in the cheap blazer, the old man had just legally erased the ground beneath their beds. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in months, I slept a deep, dreamless, and incredibly peaceful sleep. Colin did not immediately accept my command. The line remained completely silent for a long moment. I could hear the faint hum of the city traffic through his office window miles away. Colin was a man who destroyed corporate empires for a living, but he had also sat at my dinner table. He had watched Justin grow up. He knew the weight of the hammer I was asking him to drop. "Bruce," he finally said, his voice stripped of its usual sharp edge, "I need you to stop thinking like a wounded man for exactly 2 minutes. I need you to think like the contractor you used to be. Look at the blueprint of what you are building before we pour the concrete. If I initiate this sequence, there is absolutely no undoing it." "I am looking at the blueprint, Colin," I replied, my grip tightening on the heavy black phone. "Then look closer," he insisted. "If we sell this property to a commercial developer at 20% below market value, we can close the transaction in cash by tomorrow afternoon. But the second that deed transfers, the estate becomes corporate property. Justin and Megan will not just be evicted. They will be criminal trespassers the moment they step onto the driveway." "I know," I said, staring at the dark wall of my tiny room. "You do not know the half of it." Colin pushed back, his voice rising with a rare intensity. "Justin forged your signature on a medical power of attorney to secure a $500,000 loan from his own firm. When I transfer the deed, I am legally obligated to flag all outstanding liens on the property. That means I have to notify his firm that the collateral is completely fraudulent. His bosses will not just fire him, Bruce. They will permanently blacklist him. He will face federal wire fraud charges. He will lose his career, his reputation, and his freedom. He will be utterly and completely ruined by Monday morning." The words hung in the quiet air of the annex. Ruined. My own son. A sudden, suffocating wave of grief washed over me. For a fleeting moment, the cold armor I had built around my heart cracked. I did not see the arrogant executive who had snapped his fingers at me to clean up spilled wine. I saw a 7-year-old boy with a missing front tooth, proudly holding up a crooked birdhouse he had tried to build with my spare lumber. I remembered the nights I worked until my hands bled, just so he could go to the private school across town. I remembered the pride in his eyes when he got his first job. My paternal instincts screamed at me to stop. They told me to walk into the main house, tear up the forged documents, and drag my son out of bed. They urged me to shake him, to yell at him, to demand an apology, and force him to be the man I raised. A father is supposed to protect his child from the fire, not strike the match. My breathing grew shallow. My hand shook, holding the phone to my ear. Colin heard my silence. He knew exactly the battle raging inside my chest. "Bruce," he said softly, "I can draft a simple cease and desist. We can freeze the assets quietly. We can force him into a closed-door settlement. You can teach him a lesson without burning his entire life to the ground. Give me the word, and I will take the softer path." I closed my eyes. I was so close to saying yes. I was so close to giving him one last chance. But then the memory of the evening rushed back on. Not the boy from 20 years ago, but the man from 2 hours ago. I saw Megan touching the emerald necklace that belonged to the only woman I ever truly loved. I saw Justin pocketing the tip I had earned in the freezing cold. I heard the arrogant laughter of his wealthy friends as they called me a destitute charity case. I saw the deep red wine bleeding into the custom oak table I had built with my own hands. I had not just made a financial mistake. He had systematically and deliberately stripped away my humanity so he could stand taller. If I saved him now, I would not be protecting my son. I would be enabling a predator. He would learn that he could abuse, exploit, and forge his way through life without ever facing the absolute consequences of his actions. True love sometimes requires delivering the hardest lesson imaginable. "There is no softer path, Colin," I said. My voice was no longer shaking. The crack in my armor sealed shut, freezing over completely. He used my name and my legacy to build a throne of lies. Now he is going to learn what happens when you pull the foundation out from under a glass castle. Execute Protocol 0. Burn it all down. "I understand," Colin replied. The sympathy in his voice vanished instantly, replaced by the cold, calculating precision of a legal executioner. The machine is awake, Bruce. I am waking up the corporate buyers right now. We will draft the accelerated sale documents before sunrise. I am dispatching my premier extraction team to handle the physical logistics of the property. They will arrive the moment your son leaves the driveway. Make sure they are meticulous, I instructed. I want his belongings packed perfectly. I will not stoop to his level of disrespect. Put everything in a climate-controlled commercial storage unit. I want the keys in my hand by tomorrow evening. Consider it done, Colin said. By this time tomorrow, the estate will belong to a faceless holding company. The locks will be changed. The fraud alerts will be filed with his firm. He will return to a fortress he cannot enter and a life he no longer owns. I thanked my oldest friend and ended the call. I placed the encrypted phone back into the fireproof box and locked it away alongside the deed that was already becoming a piece of history. The heavy gears of a massive legal machine had begun to turn, and there was no force on earth that could stop them now. I lay back on my narrow bed and stared up at the ceiling. The lingering doubts had completely vanished. Tomorrow morning, the real work would begin. I just needed to survive one more encounter with my son, to buy the time we needed to finalize his absolute destruction. The morning sun crept through the thin blinds of the annex, casting long gray shadows across the linoleum floor. I was already awake. I had been sitting on the edge of the bed for hours, watching the dust motes dance in the pale light, waiting for the inevitable storm to hit my door. The quiet of the early morning was deceptive. Inside the main house, I knew panic was brewing. Justin had a timeline to meet for his corporate loan, and I knew exactly what he needed to finalize it. He needed my physical signature on the fraudulent paperwork to satisfy his firm's underwriters. Just before 7 in the morning, the silence was shattered. Heavy, frantic footsteps pounded across the stone patio, followed by a violent banging on my door. The wood rattled in its frame. It was not the knock of a son checking on his father. It was the frantic hammering of a cornered animal. I stood up slowly, deliberately, adopting the hunched, fragile posture of the defeated old man they believed me to be. I curled my fingers inward, locking my joints into stiff, painful claws. I took a deep breath, letting the mask fall perfectly into place, and turned the deadbolt. Justin practically shoved the door open before I could even step back. He was wearing his expensive silk pajamas, but his face was pale and slick, with a thin layer of cold sweat. His eyes darted around my small room, landing briefly on my desk before snapping back to me. He was clutching a thick stack of legal documents clamped tightly to a wooden clipboard. Megan hovered just behind his shoulder, looking equally frantic, with her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Where is the green lockbox?" Bruce Justin demanded, his voice tight and breathless. He did not bother with good morning. He did not bother asking how I felt after working in the freezing cold until midnight. "I checked the top shelf of your closet, and it is completely gone." I had been searching my room. My own son had snuck into my annex while I was out parking cars trying to steal the original property deed to satisfy his investors. He had found the decoy box empty, and now the reality of his missing collateral was choking him. I kept my face entirely blank, blinking slowly, as if my mind was struggling to process his words. I let my jaw go slightly slack, perfectly mimicking the senile charity case they had bragged about to their wealthy friends. "I moved it to the bank vault downtown a few weeks ago, Justin," I said, my voice raspy and weak. It felt much safer there. "Why do you ask? Is something wrong?" A muscle feathered violently in Justin's jaw. He exchanged a panicked look with Megan. Without the physical deed to back up the forged medical proxy, his $500,000 corporate loan was hanging by a microscopic thread. He needed a secondary verification immediately to keep his boss from looking too closely at the paperwork. He shoved the heavy clipboard into my chest, forcing me to step back to catch my balance. "Nothing is wrong," he snapped, forcing a tight, unnatural smile. "But since you moved the deed, I need you to sign these routine insurance papers right now. It is just an updated liability waiver for the guest annex. The insurance company requires the primary resident to sign off on the new coverage plan by noon today. Just sign the bottom line, and I will take care of the rest. I looked down at the clipboard. They were not insurance papers. Even without my reading glass, I could clearly see the bold legal heading of a commercial collateral transfer agreement. It was the final nail in the coffin of his massive fraud. He was standing in my home, lying directly to my face, trying to trick me into signing away my entire life savings so he could pay for his imported Italian tables and tailored suits. I slowly raised my hands. I held them up between us, trembling violently. I locked my knuckles into rigid, deformed shapes, making my fingers look like twisted roots. I let out a sharp, painful hiss and cradled my right wrist against my chest. "I am so sorry, Justin," I whispered, forcing my voice to tremble with fake shame. The cold air last night, during the party, it seeped right into my bones. My arthritis is having a severe flare-up. I cannot even make a fist, let alone grip a pen. The pain is absolutely blinding. Justin stared at my hands, his face draining of whatever color was left. "You have to sign the day, Bruce," he pleaded, his voice rising in pitch. "The underwriters, the insurance agents, will penalize us heavily if we miss the deadline. Just hold the pen for 3 seconds. That is all I am asking. Just scribble your name." He tried to force a silver pen into my twisted fingers. I let the pen clatter uselessly to the linoleum floor. I looked up at him with wide, apologetic eyes. "I cannot feel my fingers, son." I whimpered, leaning heavily against the doorframe, as if my legs were also giving out. "The doctor said when it gets this bad, I have to wait for the swelling to subside. It usually takes a day or two for the steroids to work into my joints." Megan let out a loud, frustrated groan. "This is ridiculous, Justin," she hissed, pulling her silk robe tighter around her waist. "We leave for the corporate retreat in 2 hours. We are going to be gone all night. If he does not sign this before we leave, your boss is going to start asking questions we cannot answer. Tell him to try harder." I lowered my head, hiding the absolute triumph shining in my eyes. They were leaving for their mandatory overnight retreat today. They were going to be out of the house, completely isolated from the property for the next 36 hours. It was the exact window Colin and I needed to execute Protocol Zero. I just needed to keep them on the hook. "I will take a double dose of my medication right now," I promised, looking up at Justin with a pathetic, pleading expression. "By tomorrow evening, the swelling will be completely gone. When you and Megan get back from your retreat on Friday, I will sign whatever you need. I promise, Justin. Friday evening. You have my word." Justin ran, a trembling hand through his perfectly styled hair. He was trapped. He could not physically force my hand to write without the signature looking like a forgery, and he could not risk making me suspicious by explaining the true nature of the documents. He had built his entire strategy on the assumption that I was a weak, oblivious old man. Now that very weakness was the exact thing blocking his path. "Fine," he spat, picking the pen up off the floor and snatching the clipboard back against his chest. "Friday evening. The absolute second we pull into the driveway, you are signing these papers. Do not leave the house. Do not do any heavy lifting. Just sit here and rest your hands until we get back." I nodded obediently, keeping my hands curled tightly against my chest. "I will be waiting right here," I said softly. "Have a wonderful trip." Justin turned on his heel and stormed back across the patio, with Megan trailing closely behind him, muttering angrily about how I ruined everything. I watched them disappear into the massive glass doors of the main house. The second the lock clicked shut, my posture completely transformed. The trembling stopped. My back straightened. I uncurled my fingers and flexed my hands. My joints felt perfectly fine. I walked back to my small desk and looked at the clock. It was 7:30 in the morning. They would be packing their bags and loading the car within the hour. By 9 in the morning, they would be driving down the highway, completely blind to the devastation gathering behind them. I picked up my encrypted phone and sent a single text message to Colin. The Arthritis Act worked. The targets are leaving the property. Start the clock. The trap was officially set. I had just bought myself exactly 48 hours of uninterrupted silence. 48 hours to dismantle a kingdom, to pack up their stolen lives, and to lock them out of their own illusions forever. I poured myself a cup of black coffee and sat by the window waiting for their luxury car to roll down the driveway for the very last time. The morning light caught the polished hood of Justin Luxury Sport Utility Vehicle as he loaded their designer leather weekend bags into the trunk. I stood perfectly still behind the thin curtains of my annex window, watching them prepare for their corporate retreat. Megan walked out of the main house wearing oversized sunglasses and a cashmere coat, stepping carefully in her expensive heels. She did not look toward my room. She simply slid into the passenger seat, checking her reflection in the mirror. Justin slammed the trunk shut with a heavy thud. He adjusted his collar and checked his expensive watch. He looked entirely pleased with himself. In his mind, he had successfully navigated a crisis. He believed he had intimidated a weak old man into submission and secured the massive corporate loan he desperately needed. He thought his financial future was guaranteed by the end of the week. Before getting into the driver's seat, Justin walked over to my window. I quickly slumped my shoulders and cradled my right hand against my chest, looking up at him through the glass with tired, defeated eyes. He tapped on the window pane twice. He pointed at my hands and then pointed at the ground, mouthing the words to stay inside and rest. He flashed a brilliant, arrogant smile. I nodded slowly, offering him a weak, pathetic wave. Satisfied with his absolute control, he turned around and walked back to his vehicle. The heavy doors closed, sealing them inside their bubble of leather and false security. The engine roared to life, shattering the quiet morning air. I watched as the tires rolled over the immaculate paved driveway, crunching softly against the fallen autumn leaves. The car reached the end of the property, paused at the manicured stone gates, and then turned right, disappearing completely from view. The silence that followed was absolute. I stood by the window for exactly 5 more minutes, tracking the seconds in my head. I waited until I was absolutely certain they had merged onto the main highway, heading far away toward the mountains for their retreat. Once the 5 minutes passed, I stepped back from the window. The transformation was instantaneous. I dropped my shoulders and stood up straight. The agonizing pain I had feigned in my hands vanished without a trace. I flexed my fingers, spreading them wide and curling them into tight, powerful fists. My joints did not ache. My bones were not brittle. I was a man who had spent 4 decades lifting steel and pouring concrete. And my hands were still strong enough to tear down the very foundation of the house my son was trying to steal. I walked to the small kitchenette and poured the remaining cold coffee down the drain. I did not need caffeine anymore. My veins were flooded with cold, pure adrenaline. I crossed the room to my desk and opened the bottom drawer, pulling the encrypted black phone from the heavy fireproof box. I dialed Colin. The phone rang only once before he answered. I told Colin they were gone. I confirmed that the vehicle had left the property and they were scheduled to be hours away, completely unreachable, in a remote corporate lodge until tomorrow evening. Colin did not waste time with pleasantries. He told me the corporate buyers were sitting in his downtown conference room right now. They had the cashier checks drafted and the expedited transfer documents ready to sign. He told me the commercial moving fleet was parked 2 blocks away, idling in a vacant commercial lot, waiting for my signal. He told me the locksmiths and the private security contractors were following right behind them. He asked me one final time if I was ready to execute the protocol. I looked around my tiny 400-square-foot room. I thought about the decades I spent sacrificing my own comfort, so Justin could have the best of everything. I thought about how he repaid that sacrifice by treating me like a stray dog in my own home. I thought about the forged medical proxy that sought to erase my sanity and my legal rights. I told Colin to spring the trap. I told him to sell the estate. I authorized him to accept the 20% market discount to ensure the cash cleared immediately. I gave him the green light to dispatch the moving trucks to the front gates. Colin confirmed the orders. His voice was sharp and methodical. He told me he was sliding the sale documents across the conference table to the buyers at this exact moment. He promised me that by sunset, the estate would be legally owned by the corporate developer, and my son would have absolutely nothing to his name except a massive fraudulent debt. I ended the call and slipped the phone into my pocket. I grabbed my old canvas duffel bag from this closet. I did not have much to pack. A few flannel shirts, some work pants, my heavy boots, and the framed photograph of my late wife. I zipped the bag closed and slung it over my shoulder. I walked out of the guest annex and stood in the center of the massive backyard. The house loomed over me with its massive glass windows and imported stone columns. It was a beautiful monument to greed and arrogance. It was a glass castle built entirely on lies. From down the street, I heard the heavy, unmistakable rumble of commercial diesel engines approaching. The moving trucks were arriving. The extraction team was here. The eviction protocol had officially begun. I took a deep breath of the cold morning air, feeling a profound sense of peace settle over my mind. I walked toward the front driveway, ready to dismantle a kingdom. The roaring engines of the commercial moving trucks settled into a low idle along the street. A sleek black town car pulled into the driveway, gliding smoothly over the imported stone pavers my son loved to show off to his friends. The heavy doors opened, and Colin stepped out first. He was wearing a dark, sharp suit that looked entirely out of place against the quiet suburban morning. Behind him were two men and a woman, all carrying heavy leather briefcases. They were the Wolves. They were corporate developers who specialized in buying distressed properties for immediate cash. They walked toward me. I was standing near the front porch with my old canvas duffel bag slung over my shoulder. The lead developer, a man with slicked back hair and a hungry look in his eyes, surveyed the massive glass windows and the sprawling manicured lawn. I could see the greed practically vibrating off him. He thought he was taking advantage of a desperate old man liquidating his assets in a panic. He had no idea he was simply the executioner I had hired to drop the axe on my own son. We did not go inside the house. I did not want them walking on the floors I was about to give away. We walked over to my 15-year-old pickup truck. Colin placed a thick stack of legal documents flat on the rusted hood of the truck. The cold morning wind whipped around us, but no one complained about the chill. The developers were entirely too eager to close the deal. The lead buyer tapped an expensive gold pen against the paperwork. He looked at me with a patronizing smile. He confirmed the terms out loud, just to make sure the confused old man understood what was happening. He said they were prepared to wire the funds immediately. But he reminded me that, as agreed, the purchase price was exactly 20% below the current market appraisal. He told me that was a very steep discount. He asked me if I was absolutely certain I wanted to proceed with this valuation. I stared at the bold numbers printed on the top contract. 20% of a $1.8 million estate was a staggering amount of money. It was hundreds of thousands of dollars evaporating into thin air with a single stroke of a pen. My mind flashed back to the days I spent pouring concrete in the blistering summer heat. I remembered the winters I spent framing houses with frozen fingers, wrapping my hands in thick tape just to keep working. I remembered the years of skipping vacations, driving old cars, and saving every single spare penny just to build my financial foundation. I was literally throwing away a lifetime of hard-earned wealth. A rational businessman would never take a hit like this. It was financial suicide. But I was no longer a rational businessman. I was a father administering the ultimate and most painful penalty. I looked at Colin. My lawyer watched me closely, his eyes completely neutral, waiting for my final command. He had warned me about this financial hemorrhage the night before. He knew what it cost me to build this empire from nothing. He knew the blood and sweat that those numbers represented. He gave me a look that silently asked if I was truly prepared to burn this bridge. I looked back at the developer. The 20% discount was not a loss. It was an investment. It was the absolute premium I was willing to pay to guarantee a 24-hour all-cash closing. I needed the transaction fully cleared and legally untouchable before my son returned from his corporate retreat. I needed the locks changed and the deed transferred before Justin could even attempt to leverage his forged medical proxy with his senior partners. The money I was leaving on the table was simply the heavy price of pure, unadulterated justice. I took the gold pen from the developer. It felt strange and heavy compared to the wooden carpenter pencils I was used to holding all my life. I leaned over the rusted hood of my truck. I pressed the tip to the heavy paper and signed my name. I signed every page, every addendum, every transfer of ownership. My handwriting was firm and clear. There was no arthritis today. There was no hesitation in my fingers. I signed away the walls, the roof, the imported tile, and the manicured lawn. I signed away the kingdom my son thought he ruled. Colin took the completed documents and handed them to the corporate representatives. The lead developer stepped away to make a quick phone call to his banking associates. The silence in the driveway was heavy, broken only by the distant hum of the idling moving trucks waiting down the road. Less than 2 minutes later, Colin felt his phone buzz in his jacket pocket. He pulled it out, checked the encrypted screen, and nodded to me. He confirmed that the massive wire transfer had successfully cleared the holding accounts. The money was secured in my private trust. The transaction was complete. The developers packed up their briefcases, shook my hand with wide, greedy smiles, and drove away in their black town car. I stood in the driveway with Colin. I looked up at the massive, beautiful estate. It was no longer mine. And more importantly, it was no longer Justin's. The absolute illusion of his wealth, his power, and his status had just been legally erased from the face of the earth. I handed Colin the signed authorization for the extraction team. The paperwork was finished. It was time to clear out the house. The heavy rumble of diesel engines echoed down the quiet suburban street. I stood at the edge of the driveway, watching, as a fleet of 4 massive commercial moving trucks turned past the stone gates. They parked in a perfectly synchronized line along the perimeter of the estate. 24 men in matching gray uniforms stepped out of the cabs, holding thick rolls of packing tape, heavy quilted blankets, and stacks of flattened cardboard boxes. It looked like a military operation. That was exactly what I had paid for. The foreman, a broad-shouldered man with a clipboard, walked up the driveway and stopped a few feet in front of me. He asked for my instructions. I looked him dead in the eye and laid down the absolute rules of the extraction. I told him that they had exactly 6 hours to completely empty the $1.8 million property. I told him that every single item inside that house, from the massive imported sofas to the smallest silver spoons in the kitchen drawers, had to be packed with terrifying precision. I made it completely clear that nothing was to be thrown away. Nothing was to be scratched. Nothing was to be stolen. I told him I wanted the fragile items wrapped in triple layers of bubble wrap. I wanted the tailored suits hung in specialized wardrobe boxes so they would not wrinkle. I was taking away my son's kingdom, but I refused to sink to his level. I would not destroy his property. I would not break his things out of spite. I was executing a legal eviction, not a petty act of vandalism. The perfection of the packing would be the ultimate insult. It would prove that the destitute charity case he mocked possessed a level of class and control he could never comprehend. The foreman nodded, signaling his crew to begin. The massive double doors of the estate were propped wide open. The movers flooded into the house like a swarm of organized locusts. I stepped inside the grand foyer and simply stood in the corner, watching the chaos unfold. The contrast was entirely surreal. Dozens of men were rushing up and down the sweeping staircase, shouting out dimensions and carrying heavy wooden crates. Tape guns shrieked as they sealed boxes in the kitchen. Heavy boots thudded against the imported marble floors. Yet amidst all that noise and frantic movement, I stood completely still. My heart beat with the slow, steady rhythm. The storm was raging all around me, but I was the absolute center of the calm. I walked through the formal living room. I watched four men carefully wrap the massive white sofas in thick layers of protective plastic. I watched them dismantle the expensive entertainment center, coiling the television wires neatly and taping them to the back of the screens. I felt absolutely nothing. No sadness, no regret. The house was being stripped down to its bare drywall, turning back into the empty shell it was before I bought it. I moved into the dining room. Two movers were standing over the custom white oak table I had built with my own hands. One of them admired the grain of the wood, mentioning to his partner that it looked like a highly expensive custom piece. He did not know the man who crafted it was standing right behind him. I watched them wrap the thick wooden legs in heavy moving blankets and secure them with industrial tape. Part of me mourned the loss of that table. It was a piece of my soul shaped by months of hard labor. But letting it go was a necessary amputation. The table was tainted by my son's arrogance and the spilled red wine. It was just wood now. It had lost its meaning the moment Justin used it to humiliate me. I watched them carry it out the front door without a single ounce of hesitation. I climbed the sweeping staircase and walked down the long hallway toward the master bedroom. The doors were wide open. A team of movers was emptying the massive walk-in closets. I watched them carefully transfer dozens of designer dresses and cashmere coats into tall cardboard boxes. I watched them pack my son's expensive tailored suits and row after row of polished leather shoes. These were the clothes they wore to project their false superiority to the world. Now those very clothes were being unceremoniously boxed up by the working-class men they despised so deeply. I walked over to the sprawling vanity mirror on Megan's side of the room. Her makeup and perfumes were scattered across the glass surface. Resting in the center of the table right where she had carelessly tossed it after the networking dinner was my late wife's vintage emerald necklace. I stepped forward and picked it up. The cool, heavy metal and the deep green stone felt familiar against my calloused palm. Megan had not even bothered to put it back in a jewelry box. She treated my most sacred memory like a cheap trinket. I slipped the necklace into the deep pocket of my flannel shirt, reclaiming the only item in that massive house that truly belonged to my heart. I looked at the rest of her jewelry spread across the vanity. There were diamond tennis bracelets, pearl earrings, and expensive gold watches. I did not touch a single one of them. I called a mover over and instructed him to pack every piece of her jewelry into a secure lockbox and seal it with tamper-proof tape. I wanted Megan to open her storage unit and find every single diamond perfectly accounted for. I wanted her to know that I had stood alone in her bedroom with full access to her most valuable possessions, and I chose to leave them completely untouched. My revenge was not about taking her shiny toys. My revenge was about taking the ground she walked on. The afternoon dragged on, and the vast empty spaces inside the estate began to echo. The rich, heavy curtains were taken down, exposing the large, bare windows. The rugs were rolled up, revealing the cold, bare floors. Room by room, the house was systematically erased. I stood in the center of the grand foyer, watching the final boxes being loaded onto hand trucks. The foreman approached me, wiping sweat from his forehead. He handed me a thick clipboard listing the entire inventory of the home. Every single item had been packed, loaded, and secured in the commercial trucks parked outside. The house was entirely empty. I took the clipboard and signed my name on the bottom line, authorizing the final transport to the storage facility. I thanked the foreman for his incredible precision. The movers walked out the front doors, and I was left standing completely alone in the massive, hollow estate. The echo of my boots against the bare floors sounded like the ticking of a giant clock. The extraction was complete. The illusion was packed away in cardboard boxes. Now all I had to do was secure the perimeter and wait for the king and queen to return to their stolen castle. The heavy diesel engines roared to life, shaking the quiet suburban street as the convoy of moving trucks began their slow march toward the city. I climbed into the cab of my 15-year-old pickup truck, the worn bench seat offering a familiar comfort. I put the truck in gear and pulled out behind the massive white trailers. We formed a strange procession, a line of commercial vehicles carrying the entirety of my son's fabricated kingdom, being escorted by the very man he called a destitute charity case. I followed the trucks onto the highway, keeping a steady distance. I watched the massive metal doors of the trailers reflecting the afternoon sun. Inside those dark cargo holds were the tailored suits, the designer dresses, the crystal glasses, and the imported rugs that Justin and Megan used to shield themselves from the reality of their own failures. They had spent years accumulating objects to prove their superiority to the world. Now all those precious objects were packed tightly into cardboard boxes, bouncing along the interstate completely stripped of their power. We arrived at the commercial storage facility just outside the city limits. I had instructed Colin to reserve their largest premium unit. It was a high-security, climate-controlled facility with pristine concrete floors and bright fluorescent lighting. I did not choose a cheap, damp warehouse. I refused to let my son claim that I had ruined his belongings out of spite. I was going to preserve his hollow life in perfect condition, proving that my actions were driven by cold justice, not petty revenge. The moving trucks backed up to the massive loading bays, their air brakes hissing loudly in the cavernous facility. The foreman signaled his crew, and the heavy rolling doors of the trailers were thrown open. I stood off to the side with my arms crossed over my flannel shirt, watching the reverse process of the extraction. Dozens of men began wheeling the carefully wrapped furniture down the metal ramps. I watched the towering stack of wardrobe boxes roll past me, containing thousands of dollars of silk and cashmere. I watched them carefully maneuver the custom white oak dining table I had built, ensuring the padded blankets did not slip from the heavy iron legs. As the items were carried into the sterile, brightly lit concrete room, the illusion of their wealth completely evaporated. In the grand estate, with its soaring ceilings and imported marble, those objects had projected an aura of untouchable success. But here, stacked floor to ceiling in a windowless storage unit, they just looked like ordinary things. The magic was gone. Stripped of the mansion, Justin and Megan were just two people with far too much stuff and no ground to put it on. The movers worked with incredible efficiency. Box after box was stacked with architectural precision, creating a towering wall of cardboard and moving blankets. The massive 10 by 30-foot room slowly filled up, reaching its absolute capacity. I stood at the threshold observing the meticulous organization. Not a single box was crushed. Not a single piece of furniture was scratched. The extraction had been flawless. The foreman approached me carrying his thick clipboard. He handed me the final inventory manifest, a document. Dozens of pages long, detailing every single item that had been removed from the estate. I reviewed the signatures, confirming that the chain of custody was complete. I thanked him for his team's professionalism and handed him a generous cash tip, pulling the bills from my old leather wallet. The movers packed up their equipment, loaded their ramps, and drove their empty trucks out of the facility, leaving me completely alone in the echoing concrete hallway. I walked down the corridor toward the facility management office. A polite manager behind a glass partition processed the rental agreement. I handed her my corporate card and prepaid the rent for the premium unit for exactly 1 month. I wanted to ensure that Justin had a narrow window to retrieve his life before the facility auctioned it off. I was forcing him to face reality, but I was not going to let a stranger buy my late wife's emerald necklace or my handmade table at a blind auction if things escalated. I signed the rental agreement in my name, naming Justin as the only authorized secondary contact, but exclusively withholding the physical access rights. The manager handed me a heavy brass padlock in its original plastic packaging. I thanked her and walked back down the long, brightly lit corridor toward the open storage unit. I stood at the threshold, looking at the mountain of boxes one last time. This was the sum total of my son's adult life. Everything he valued, everything he used to measure his worth against others, was sitting in the dark, waiting for him. I reached up and grabbed the handle of the heavy corrugated steel door. I pulled it down with a smooth, forceful motion. The metal door slid along its greased tracks and slammed against the concrete floor with a deafening, echoing crash. The sound was incredibly final. It was the sound of a vault sealing shut on a life built entirely on deceit. I tore the plastic packaging off the brass padlock. I slid the thick, curved metal bar through the steel latch on the door, pulling it tight. I squeezed the lock with my calloused hand, pushing the mechanism down until it secured with a heavy, definitive click. I pulled the small silver key from the bottom of the lock. I held it in the palm of my hand, staring at the jagged edges of the metal. It weighed almost nothing, but it was the heaviest object I had ever held. This single piece of silver was no longer just a key. It was the ultimate physical manifestation of my reclaimed power. It was the absolute, undeniable proof that the invisible handyman, the destitute father, had completely outmaneuvered the arrogant finance executive. Justin thought he held all the cards. He thought his forged medical proxy and his cruel jokes had stripped me of my agency. But he was about to return from his luxurious corporate retreat to find that his mansion belonged to a faceless corporation, and his entire material existence was locked behind a steel door. And the only way to open that door was to stand in front of the man he had humiliated and ask for the key. I slipped the silver key into the deep chest pocket of my flannel shirt, right next to the vintage emerald necklace I had reclaimed from Megan's vanity. The cold metal rested against my heart, a quiet reminder that the hardest part of the war was already won. I turned away from the locked steel door and walked down the long, silent corridor toward the exit. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the parking lot. I climbed back into my 15-year-old pickup truck and started the engine. The storage transfer was complete. The trap was fully loaded. Now all I had to do was drive back to the estate meet with the commercial locksmiths and stand on the empty porch, waiting for the king to return to a castle he no longer owned. I pulled my rusted truck back into the long, circular driveway of the estate. The massive moving trucks were long gone, replaced now by a fleet of unmarked white commercial vans. Colin was standing near the front porch, talking to a man in a hard hat, holding a digital tablet. The corporate buyers wasted absolutely no time. They were taking physical possession of their new asset, and they were not taking any chances with the security of a property they had just purchased for over $1 million in cash. I walked up the stone steps, listening to the high-pitched whine of industrial power drills echoing from inside the empty foyer. A team of commercial security contractors was moving rapidly from door to door. I stood in the doorway and watched as a worker aggressively ripped the ornate brass handle off the solid oak front door, leaving a jagged, exposed hole in the expensive wood. They were not just swapping out traditional deadbolts. They were installing heavy-duty commercial-grade biometric keypads. Thick black steel boxes with glowing red digital interfaces replaced every polished brass fixture. These were the kind of locks you see on corporate server rooms and bank vaults, not suburban homes. Within an hour, the sprawling luxury estate was completely fortified. Every entry point, every sliding glass patio door, and every garage access panel was sealed behind a blinking digital wall. The house no longer looked like a home. Without the designer furniture, the imported rugs, and the warm ambient lighting, it looked exactly like what it now was: a cold, sterile holding facility for a faceless real estate corporation. The echo of the contractor's boots against the bare marble floors sounded hollow and lifeless. Colin walked over to me and handed me a single crisp sheet of paper. It was the final sign-off confirming that the property was legally secured and the corporate transfer was absolutely complete. He looked around the empty, echoing foyer and let out a low whistle. He told me he had executed dozens of hostile takeovers in his career, but he had never seen a residential extraction executed with such terrifying efficiency. He shook my hand, told me to keep my phone close, and walked back to his town car, leaving me alone with the contractors. I walked around to the back of the property toward my small guest annex for the very last time. The door was propped open. The contractors had already stripped the lock on my room too, replacing it with a cold black keypad. I walked inside and picked up my old canvas duffel bag from the center of the bare linoleum floor. It contained a few flannel shirts, my heavy boots, and the framed photograph of my late wife. That was it. That was the sum total of my physical existence in this place. I did not need a fleet of commercial trucks to move my life. I carried everything that mattered over my right shoulder. I walked back out to my truck and tossed the duffel bag onto the worn passenger seat. I shut the heavy metal door, listening to the familiar rattle of the old hinges. I stood in the driveway, leaning against the cold hood of my truck, and I took one final long look at the property. The sun was beginning to dip below the tree line, casting long, sharp shadows across the manicured lawn. The glowing red lights of the new biometric locks pierced through the gathering dusk like the eyes of a guard dog. The estate was locked down tight, an impenetrable fortress standing in the quiet suburbs. Justin and Megan were currently sitting in some luxury resort, sipping expensive cocktails and dreaming of the $500,000 loan they thought they had secured. They believed they had completely outsmarted a weak old man. They believed they owned the world and everyone in it. But tomorrow evening, they would drive up to this exact spot and find their shiny metal keys completely useless. They would find an empty fortress staring back at them, completely stripped of their wealth, their status, and their illusions. The trap was perfectly set. The bait was gone, and the steel jaws were locked into place. I climbed into the driver's seat of my truck, turned the ignition, and listened to the old engine roar to life. I put the truck in gear, drove past the grand stone gates, and merged onto the main road. I did not look in the rearview mirror. I just drove into the quiet, fading light, completely at peace, ready to watch their empire burn. The crisp autumn evening had fully settled over the quiet suburban neighborhood by the time the luxury sport utility vehicle turned onto the familiar street. The heavy tires rolled smoothly over the expensive stone pavers of the driveway. Inside the car, Justin and Megan were exhausted from a long overnight corporate retreat, but their posture radiated pure, arrogant triumph. They believed they had won. They thought they had secured a $500,000 corporate loan using forged documents and intimidated an old man into complete silence. Megan checked her reflection in the passenger mirror, adjusting her designer coat. Justin parked the car near the grand stone pillars of the front porch, cutting the engine. They stepped out into the freezing night air, completely oblivious to the fact that they were walking onto a heavily fortified corporate compound. Justin grabbed his leather overnight bag from the trunk and walked confidently up the stone steps. He was already talking about opening an expensive bottle of wine to celebrate his upcoming promotion. He reached into his tailored pocket and pulled out his heavy silver keyring. He stepped up to the massive double doors and extended his hand toward the brass lock. He froze. The polished brass handle was completely gone. In its place was a thick black steel box with a glowing red digital keypad. Justin blinked, staring at the cold electronic interface. He stepped back, thinking for a brief, impossible second that he had driven to the wrong house. But the stone pillars and the sprawling lawn were definitely his. He reached out and pushed against the heavy oak wood. The door did not move a single millimeter. Megan walked up behind him, shivering in the cold wind. She asked him what was taking so long and why he was just standing there. Justin muttered that something was wrong with the door. He assumed his father had made a terrible mistake and hired a contractor to replace the locks without asking him. His confusion quickly boiled over into entitlement and rage. He pounded his fist against the heavy oak door, shouting my name, demanding that I open it immediately. He expected the weak old man to come shuffling to the foyer, apologizing for the inconvenience. He expected the door to swing open so he could march inside and reclaim his stolen throne. But the house remained completely dark and entirely silent. From the deep shadows near the side of the sprawling porch, a heavy-set figure stepped forward into the glow of the red digital lights. It was not a confused old man in a cheap blazer. It was a massive man wearing a dark tactical uniform and heavy boots. A silver badge gleamed on his chest, reflecting the dim porch lights. He was a professional private security contractor hired by the corporate developers to protect their newly acquired million-dollar asset. The guard stopped at the top of the steps, looking down at Justin and Megan with absolute cold authority. He placed his hands on his utility belt and asked them to step away from the entrance immediately. Justin let out a loud, arrogant laugh, completely failing to read the danger of the situation. He stepped toward the guard, puffing out his chest and demanding to know who the man was and what he was doing on his property. Justin ordered the guard to step aside and open the door, claiming he was the primary resident and a highly successful finance executive. The security guard did not flinch. He did not care about designer coats or imported cars. His voice was deep and completely devoid of emotion when he informed them that they were standing on private commercial property. He clearly stated that the estate belonged to a corporate holding company and that anyone lacking authorized biometric access was considered a criminal trespasser. Megan let out a sharp gasp, clutching her designer bag to her chest. She looked at Justin, her eyes wide with sudden panic. Justin turned bright red with fury, refusing to accept the reality, staring him right in the face. He stepped forward, aggressively raising his voice and pointing his finger directly at the guard's chest. He screamed that he owned the house and that he was going to have the guard fired and arrested for harassment. He lunged forward, trying to physically push his way past the massive man to reach the digital keypad. The security guard moved with terrifying speed. He planted a heavy, solid hand flat against Justin's chest, stopping his forward momentum instantly. The impact knocked the breath out of Justin, forcing him to stumble backward down the stone steps. The guard unclipped a heavy black radio from his tactical belt. He looked down at the furious, desperate man in the expensive suit and delivered a final absolute warning. The guard told him that if he took one more aggressive step toward the corporate facility, he would dispatch the local police and press immediate charges for assault and trespassing. The absolute certainty in the guard's voice hit Justin like a physical blow. The heavy reality of the situation finally began to pierce through his thick armor of arrogance. He looked at the glowing red locks on his front door. He looked at the massive security contractor standing guard over his home. His hands began to shake as a cold, suffocating panic gripped his throat. He had absolutely no idea how his perfect world had just been locked away from him, but he was completely terrified to find out. The freezing wind whipped across the dark driveway as Justin stood trembling at the bottom of the stone steps. Megan was sobbing quietly, wrapping her cashmere coat tight against the biting cold. The massive security contractor remained perfectly still, an immovable wall of dark fabric and quiet authority. Justin paced back and forth, pulling his phone from his pocket, his fingers shaking so violently he could barely unlock the screen. He muttered that he was calling the police. He swore he would have someone arrested for this massive misunderstanding. Before he could dial a single number, a pair of bright headlights pierced the darkness at the end of the street. The heavy, unmistakable rumble of an old diesel engine shattered the quiet suburban night. The 15-year-old rusted pickup truck turned slowly past the stone gates. It rolled up the driveway, the headlights sweeping across the manicured lawn and landing directly on Justin and Megan. Justin squinted against the bright glare. When he recognized the battered grille of the truck, his confusion instantly morphed into absolute explosive fury. He dropped his phone back into his pocket and charged toward the vehicle, his face twisted in a mask of pure, unhinged rage. He believed his weak, destitute father had somehow caused this mess. He believed the old man had accidentally triggered a security lockdown or failed to pay a critical bill. Justin stood in the center of the driveway, screaming at the top of his lungs. He demanded to know what his father had done to his house. He accused the old man of robbing him while he was away on his corporate retreat. He shouted that he was calling the cops right now and sending his own father to prison for burglary and trespassing. He pointed a shaking finger at the truck, spewing every vile insult he could summon, completely abandoning his polished executive persona. The heavy truck engine cut off, leaving only the sound of Justin's screaming echoing in the cold air. The rusted metal door opened with a loud creak. I stepped out of the cab and my heavy work boots hit the expensive stone pavers with a solid, definitive thud. I did not cower. I did not apologize. I did not hunch my shoulders or cradle my hands in fake arthritic pain. I stood perfectly straight, a 70-year-old man with a spine made of steel. I closed the truck door and walked slowly toward my son. I was wearing my heavy flannel shirt and work jeans, completely unfazed by the freezing temperature. In my right hand, I held a single plain manila folder. I did not say a word as I closed the distance between us. The sheer force of my absolute calm was like a wall of ice. Justin continued to scream, but his voice began to falter as I drew closer. He noticed my posture. He noticed the steady, dangerous clarity in my eyes. The pathetic charity case he loved to mock had vanished completely. But what finally silenced him was the reaction of the security guard. As I reached the edge of the porch, the massive tactical guard did not order me to step back. He did not ask for my identification or tell me I was trespassing on corporate property. Instead, the guard turned his head slightly, looked me directly in the eye, and gave me a short, respectful nod, acknowledging my authority. Justin saw the silent exchange, his brain completely short-circuited. He looked from the massive, heavily armed guard to his flannel-wearing father. The arrogant threats died in his throat. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. The absolute reality that I was in complete control of the situation began to crush him like a physical weight. Megan stepped forward, her voice trembling and weak. She asked what was happening and why the guard was letting me stand there. She demanded that I explain why they were locked out of their own home. I stopped exactly 2 feet away from Justin. The night air was totally still. I looked at the boy I had given my entire life to protect. I looked at the man who had stolen my dead wife's necklace and mocked my craftsmanship to impress a room full of strangers. There was no pity left in my heart. There was only the quiet, absolute delivery of pure justice. I raised my right hand and extended the manila folder toward his chest. I did not raise my voice. I did not shout or curse. I spoke with a quiet, lethal authority that cut straight through the freezing wind. I told him to open the folder. Justin stared at the plain brown paper. His hands were shaking so hard he could barely lift his arms. He slowly reached out and took the folder from my grip, holding it as if it were a live explosive. He looked down at it and then back up at me, his eyes wide with a terrifying, desperate realization. He finally understood that the glass castle he built had just shattered into a million tiny pieces. The truth was resting right there in the palm of his trembling hands. Justin opened the thick manila folder. The autumn wind caught the edge of the heavy paper, but his hands were gripping it so tightly his knuckles were completely white. He looked down at the first document. It was the official bill of sale and the newly recorded property deed. He stared at the bold black letters, trying to make sense of the legal terminology. He read the name of the blind limited liability company that had owned the house, and he read my name listed as the sole proprietor. Then he read the name of the massive corporate developer that had purchased the estate entirely in cash that very morning. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like an absolute ghost standing in the freezing driveway. He finally realized that he had never owned a single blade of grass on that sprawling property. He realized that this massive mansion he used to project his fabricated wealth to the world had belonged to the destitute charity case all along. I had sold the ground right out from under his feet while he was sitting in meetings at his corporate retreat. He dropped the first page, letting it flutter uselessly onto the cold stone pavers. Megan stepped closer, shivering violently, and looked over his trembling shoulder to see the second item in the folder. It was a small silver key taped to a pristine white invoice. She picked up the key, staring at the attached commercial storage facility tag. I told them that their designer clothes, their expensive furniture, and their stolen luxury lifestyle were locked inside a windowless concrete room across town. I informed Megan that the vintage emerald necklace she had taken from my private safe was resting safely in my front pocket, and that I had left her costume jewelry perfectly boxed up. She read the invoice attached to the key. It was a meticulously itemized bill for 36 months of back rent for occupying the main house along with the immense costs of the commercial extraction team. It was a staggering debt, totaling well over $100,000. Megan let out a sharp, breathless sob that echoed across the empty yard. Her knees gave out completely, and she collapsed onto the cold, hard stone of the driveway, weeping bitterly into her expensive cashmere coat. She realized that she had no mansion, no jewelry, and absolutely nowhere to sleep. The high society life she had built by stepping on my dignity was entirely gone. She was sitting on the freezing ground, with nothing but a storage unit key and a massive bill she could never afford to pay. But the absolute final blow was waiting on the last page of the folder. Justin pulled out the final document, and his eyes locked onto the official letterhead of Collins' powerful law firm. It was a formal legal notice of fraud. The document detailed the forged medical power of attorney and the fraudulent collateral paperwork Justin had submitted to his senior partners to secure his corporate loan. The notice explicitly stated that his firm had been legally notified of the forgery and the impending federal investigation early that afternoon. Justin stopped breathing. The cold night air seemed to completely leave his lungs. He knew exactly what that piece of paper meant. His boss, Mr. Sullivan, had already received the fraud alert and seen the undeniable proof. His career as a finance executive was instantly and permanently destroyed. He would be blacklisted from every major financial institution in the country. The federal authorities would be opening an investigation into the wire fraud by Monday morning. His entire future, his freedom, and his reputation had been vaporized with a single legal notice. He fell to his knees, landing hard on the driveway right next to his sobbing wife. The heavy silver keyring he had used to try and open the front door slipped from his numb fingers and clinked sharply against the stone. He looked up at me from the ground, his eyes wide and completely hollow. He was no longer the arrogant king of a glass castle. He was a broken, ruined man, staring up at the father he had systematically tried to destroy. I looked down at the two of them shivering and weeping in the freezing night. I did not feel any pity or remorse. They had dug their own graves with their immense greed, their blinding arrogance, and their relentless cruelty. They had handed me the shovel and demanded that I jump in. I simply took the shovel and buried their illusions instead. The massive biometric locks on the front door glowed red in the darkness, silently confirming that the fortress was sealed and the legal execution was absolutely complete. Megan lifted her head from the cold stone pavers. Her expensive makeup ran down her face in dark, messy streaks. She hugged her cashmere coat tightly against the freezing autumn wind, sobbing uncontrollably. She looked up at me with wild, desperate eyes, completely stripped of the arrogant superiority she had paraded around the networking party. She screamed, asking me what they were supposed to do now. She demanded to know where they were supposed to sleep tonight, since I had locked them out of their own home and taken all their money. Her high-pitched voice echoed down the quiet suburban street, completely ignored by the massive security guard standing on the porch. I looked down at her, crying, on the driveway. I looked at Justin, who was still kneeling on the freezing ground, staring blankly at the legal notice of his ruined career. I remembered the grand dining room. I remembered the heavy custom oak table I had built with my own scarred hands. I remembered Justin smirking at his wealthy boss, claiming he had imported my hard work from Europe just to make me look like a pathetic fool. The corners of my mouth lifted into a very small, cold smile. I looked at my son and told him I heard they have great imported Italian benches at the park downtown. The words landed with absolute, devastating precision. Justin slowly raised his head, his hollow eyes meeting mine. He recognized the callback instantly. The cruel joke he had used to humiliate me in front of his elite colleagues had just been weaponized and handed right back to him. The absolute weight of his failure crushed whatever fight he had left in his body. He lowered his head back toward the cold stone, completely broken. There was nothing left to say. The trial was over and the sentence had been fully executed. I turned my back on them. I did not wait for a response or a meaningless apology. I walked away from the glowing red biometric locks and the massive security guard. I walked across the driveway and climbed into the cab of my 15-year-old rusted pickup truck. I shut the heavy metal door and turned the key in the ignition. The old diesel engine roared to life, easily drowning out the pathetic sound of Megan's sobbing. I put the truck in gear and pulled away from the grand stone pillars, leaving my son and his wife sitting on the freezing ground. I merged onto the main road and drove off into the deep, quiet night, entirely at peace. The fallout over the next few months was absolute and unforgiving. The corporate firm did not just fire Justin, they made a brutal example of him. The federal investigation into his forged collateral documents completely destroyed his professional reputation. He was permanently blacklisted from the financial industry, stripped of his corporate license, and left drowning in a massive mountain of legal debt. The glamorous high society lifestyle he craved so desperately vanished overnight, leaving him with absolutely nothing. Megan could not endure the harsh reality of a working-class existence. The moment the luxury cars were repossessed and the storage unit was auctioned off to pay their massive legal fees, she packed whatever clothes she could carry and left him. She moved into a tiny, cramped apartment on the noisy industrial side of the city, forced to take a grueling minimum wage job just to keep the lights on. The glass castle they had built together shattered into dust, and they were both left to walk barefoot across the broken pieces. I never saw or spoke to either of them again. I did not need to. I took the immense cash payout from the corporate developer and left the sprawling, wealthy suburbs completely behind me. I drove hundreds of miles up north into the deep, quiet woods and purchased a beautiful timber cabin sitting right on the edge of a crystal-clear lake. It was a modest, simple home surrounded by towering pine trees and fresh mountain air, far away from the toxic greed of the city. I woke up early this morning, just as the golden sun began to crest over the calm water. I walked out onto my wooden porch, wearing my heavy flannel shirt and my old work boots. I sat down in a handcrafted rocking chair, holding a warm mug of black coffee in my strong, steady hands. There were no luxury cars parked outside. There were no arrogant executives demanding I wipe their floors. There were no lies and absolutely no betrayals. There was only the gentle sound of the morning wind moving through the tall trees and the soft ripple of the lake against the rocky shore. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the crisp mountain air fill my lungs. I took a sip of my dark coffee and smiled, enjoying the absolute perfect silence I had finally earned. The greatest lesson I learned from this ordeal is that family is not simply determined by blood. True family is built on mutual respect and genuine loyalty. For decades, I believed that being a good father meant sacrificing my own dignity to ensure my son had an easier life. But I finally realized that enabling arrogance and greed is not love. We must never allow our kindness to be mistaken for weakness. Setting firm boundaries, even when it requires dismantling the life you built for them, is the most profound act of self-respect. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below.